I'm going to read for you three different passages. I'd like for you to find the common thread in all of these. Are you ready? How about Genesis chapter 37, beginning in verse 23? When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore. They took him and they threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. They sat down then to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing gum and balm and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. And so the Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up out of the pit. They lifted him up. They sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. The next passage, Job chapter 1. Beginning in verse 13, there was a day when Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you." But while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you." And while he was yet speaking, there came yet another and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid upon the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you." And while he was yet speaking, another came and said, "Your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are all dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you." And then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshiped. How about Jeremiah chapter 38? Beginning in verse 1. Now Shephatiah and Gedaliah and Jucal and Pashur, they heard the words that Jeremiah had been preaching to all the people. "Thus says the Lord, he who stays in the city shall die by the sword, by famine and pestilence. But he who goes out to the Chaldeans shall live. He shall have his life as a prize of war and live. Thus says Jehovah, this city shall surely be taken into the hand of the army of the king of Babylon, and shall be taken." And so the officials came to the king and said, "Let this man be put to death. He is weakening the hands of the soldiers who are left in the city. He's weakening the hands of all the people by speaking such words to them. This man is not seeking the welfare of this people, but their harm." And King Zedekiah said, "He's in your hands." And so they took Jeremiah and they cast him into the cistern of Melchiah, the king's son, which was in the court of the guard. They let Jeremiah down into the cistern by ropes. There was no water there, but only mud, and Jeremiah sank in the mud. That's not a hard one to find the common thread, is it? What you find in all of these passages is sometimes bad things happen to good people. True in the case of Joseph, of course, true in the case of Job, true in the case of Jeremiah. And I've heard the pushback. They'll say, "Well, preacher, you know the rest of the story." In each of those cases, Joseph, his story turned out to be pretty awesome, right? And we know the rest of the story when it comes to Job. I mean, in the end, he had a lot of stuff, right? And Jeremiah, we know how his story ends. He was actually pulled out of that pit and lived to see another day. But not all the stories of these righteous individuals in the Bible ended like these 3. And so you have the story of Abel. You know his story. By the way, he was the righteous one of the 2 brothers, Cain and Abel. Abel gets a shout out in Hebrews chapter 11 as being a man of faith. How did his story end? Or how about John the Baptist in the New Testament? Actually lived and died under the Mosaic age, and so patriarchal, Mosaic age with John the Baptist, And again, we know his story, righteous man. Jesus said, of those born of women, That is, of those who are not a part of the kingdom that had yet to be established at that time. He said, of those born of women, there's been none greater than John the Baptist. You talk about a good man. John the Baptist was a good man. So why was he beheaded in prison? How about Stephen? Again, you know the story of Stephen, that preacher deacon, the first Christian martyr, stoned to death because he had the courage to speak the truth to powerful people. Yeah, not all stories end like Joseph's or Job's. Not all stories end in a way that we would say, yeah, that he was vindicated. How do you explain those? We need to understand that hardship is a part of life. Sometimes we experience hard times because we've done sinful things. And it's very easy to see the cause and effect relationship there. You do bad things, you do sinful things, you can expect your life's probably going to be hard. Doesn't always work out that way, but quite often it does. But sometimes bad things happen to good people. And we're using good in the sense that the Word of God uses. I mean, there's a sense in which there's none good. We know that, right? So there's none that's perfect. We're not talking about that. We're talking about people who are walking in the light. They're walking with God. They have a relationship with God. And yet their life just seems to have one roadblock after another, one difficulty after another. It sometimes seems it's random. I mean, why is it that sometimes a righteous individual will experience tremendous hurt and hardship? Sometimes tragedy. It does seem random sometimes, just because. I'm persuaded there's no such thing as random hardships, but it does seem that way sometimes, doesn't it? We know the original cause of all the hardship in life. You can trace it all back to Genesis chapter 3. And so early in the chapter, you have the temptation of Eve and then Adam, and they both succumb to the temptation. They sin, and so God now is meting out the results of that. I mean, here's the consequences of sin. Look at verse 17. To Adam, God said, because you listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you that you shall not eat of it. Listen to these words. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, until you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, you are dust, and unto dust you shall return. Physical death. All the hardships of life can ultimately be traced back to Genesis chapter 3. And God's people are not exempt from this. Again, so many passages we could look at. Hebrews chapter 11 is one that always comes to my mind. In Hebrews chapter 11, all those great heroes of faith, and we read about these faithful men and women who did some pretty amazing things because of their great faith. But about midway through verse 35, Hebrews 11 and verse 35, but some were tortured. How do you explain that? Refusing to accept release so that they might gain a better life. Others suffered mockings and floggings. Severe beatings is what that is. Chains and imprisonment. How do you explain that? They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with a sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats. They were destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered about in deserts and in mountains and in dens and in caves of the earth. How do you explain that? How do you explain that a righteous individual, which is the context of Hebrews chapter 11, these were all people of faith, strong faith. How do you explain that sometimes, not always, but sometimes your strong faith ends up like this? How do you explain that? And yet we know that it happens. The passage that Charlie read for us a few moments ago in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 45, God makes his sun to rise upon the evil and the good. He sends rain upon the just and the unjust. And so sometimes, again, from a worldly perspective, it does seem random. It does seem like there's just really no explanation. It just is what it is. And so we're kind of left wondering, why is it that bad things happen to good people? There are a number of possible responses that people can have when bad things happen to them. And you can see all of these illustrated numerous times in the scriptures. One possible response, just do what Job's wife did, what she counseled her husband to do. Just curse God and die, Job. Be done with it. Curse God and die. Clearly, God has been displeased with you. These horrible things would not be happening to you if God wasn't displeased with you. I don't know what you did, but something is wrong here. Just curse him and die and be done with it. Now, brethren, that's a blasphemous response. What it says is that God either was powerless to enter into this situation and fix it, or he has no love, he has no compassion. I mean, why else can you explain God allowing these horrible things to happen to Job? And so that was her response. It's just blame God, curse him, and be done with it. Or to take it to the next extremes, just deny God altogether. You know, we just commemorated the World Trade Center towers that went down on 9/11. Just a few days ago, we commemorated that anniversary. It was shortly after that a reporter was interviewing a woman in New York City. Again, just days after that attack. And the reporter says, "So are you praying for those who are lost?" And she said, "Pray? To whom shall I pray? Where was God when this happened?" That's how atheists look at the world. That's how they explain bad things happening to good people, because there is no God. I want to read a quote from you from a book. It's called Atheism, The Case Against God, written by George H. Smith. It's one of the premier books on atheism, and a defense of atheism basically is what it is. And here's what he has to say about this. He writes, now again, this is an atheist writing. He says, "Why is there evil in the creation of an omnibenevolent deity, that is, a God who is all good? Why is there evil in the creation of an omnibenevolent deity? Why, in a world for which God is ultimately responsible, are there natural disasters that kill millions? Why are there diseases that cause suffering and cripple innocent men, women, and children? Indeed, why is there evil and suffering of any kind? Must not God bear responsibility for these things? Do they not demonstrate that God cannot be all good? This problem of evil is frequently considered to be the major objection to the Christian concept of God." And you know, he's right about that. That is the major objection that atheists, that unbelievers have to the biblical concept of God, whom we think of as being omnibenevolent. He is an all-good God. Then how do you explain this? How do you explain when bad things happen, especially to good people? Well, Psalm 14 in verse 1 is still there. Psalm 14 in verse 1 simply says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." That's still true. There is too much evidence out there for a divine creator, to an intelligent designer. There's too much evidence to deny it. I could more easily deny that this building has a builder than to deny that there is a creator that has created everything that we see around us. There's just simply too much complexity, too much evidence of intelligent design. That's why it would be a fool who would say that there is no God. But that still doesn't answer the question, does it? If the question is, where was God when all of this happened? The answer is actually pretty simple. He's in the same place he's always been. which, as Paul told the pagans of Athens in Acts chapter 17, is not far from any of us. God is never far from any of us. May I suggest to you, instead of blaming God or denying God, may I suggest to you that you draw closer to God in times of great difficulties. Tragedy is not the time to abandon God. Isaiah put it like this, chapter 55 and verse 6, seek the Lord while he may be found. Yeah, we need to be doing that. We need to seek the Lord while he may be found. Moses tells us in Deuteronomy chapter 8 that there actually is a purpose that is served by the hardships and difficulties of life. This is a hard lesson to learn, brethren. The time to learn it is before the hardship hits you right square between the eyes. Steel yourself now with this understanding of why bad things happen to good people. Let's just read a brief passage here, Deuteronomy chapter 8, beginning in verse 2. Moses addressing the children of Israel. This is after the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. I think it'd be hard for us to really appreciate how difficult those 40 years were. But after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, verse 2, Moses says, remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you for these 40 years in the wilderness, so that, you want a purpose? So that he might humble you. Do we need humbling sometimes? The answer is yes, we do. Yes, we do. Testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not, whether you would do what he says or whether you would just blame God, deny God, curse God, blaspheme God. He's putting you to the test. He humbled you, verse 3, he humbled you. He let you hunger. That's interesting. God let you go hungry, and then he fed you with manna so that he might make you to know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Brethren, we need to draw closer to God because there's a lot of good lessons to be learned from the hardships of life, and you don't learn them by cursing God, blaming God, denying God. You don't learn the lessons of hardship that way. We have discussed in lessons past, and so I'm not going to belabor the point. But those big three motivators for the people of God, things like faith and hope and love, those three great motivators, all of them are enhanced in the hardships of life. They are made stronger, not on the mountaintops, but in the valleys of life. Faith in God is made stronger when we are in the valleys, when we're going through the hard times. You realize that no longer are you the master of your own destiny. No longer are you in control of the ship. You need to let God be in control of the ship. And you don't learn that while you're on the mountaintops. You learn it while you're down in the valleys. Hope is the same way. Hope, the book of Hebrews describes it as an anchor of the soul. It anchors your soul. You use anchors in the storms of life. Just sang about that a few minutes ago. You use an anchor in the storms of life when you want the ship to be steadied. The Hebrew writer says hope, the hope of everlasting life, the hope of heaven, the hope of things beyond this life. Let me tell you, brethren, that hope gets stronger when you're in the valleys. It gets stronger when you're going through the hardships of life. There is a purpose served in the hardships of life. And love, you will develop a greater empathy for the hurts of other people when you've been there yourself. Those who've never experienced debilitating hurt find it hard to empathize with those who have. And so, yeah, there's actually a lot of good that can come from the hardships of life. The atheists, who say if he was a good God, he wouldn't do stuff like that. Let me tell you, a good God is going to teach you how to be the best man or woman you can be. And if he has to use tough love to teach you those lessons, he will do that. I've often said he is the one who wrote the book on tough love. Parents could learn a lesson from how God has dealt with his own children. But there are three promises that God has given to us that I believe really make the case why we should draw near to him, even in the difficulties of life. I've got them all listed up here on the screen with the passages that go with them. Let's look at them one at a time, and then the lesson will be yours. We need to draw closer to God in hard times because, first of all, he has promised, I will never leave you, I will never forsake you. This from Hebrews chapter 13, and beginning in verse 5, where he's talking to us, he says, keep your life free from the love of money. Be content with what you have. And this is not just a money thing. I want you to understand this. I know that's immediately what he's talking about here, but we need to think of this in broader context. Be content with your station in life, your circumstances in life, even the hardships of life. Learn to be content with those things. Why? Because he has said, I will never leave you, I will never forsake you. So that we might confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? He's quoting here, of course, from Deuteronomy chapter 31, toward the end of the book of Deuteronomy. You know what happens just about 3 chapters later? Moses dies. The one who has led the people of Israel for 80 years, 40 years. He has led them now for 40 years. And now he's not going to be with them anymore. Moses will leave them. But God said, I never will leave you. And that's how it is with you and me, isn't it? Your loved ones, they will one day leave you. Through death, if nothing else. But God will never leave you. Your friends will one day leave you. I'm not saying they will abandon you. I'm just saying one day the day will come when you will see your friend no more. Not in this life. But God will never leave you. Your mentors, those whom you look up to, those godly men and women that you want to emulate, one day they will be gone. But God will never leave you. It is true that bad things happen to good people. But God has promised, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. And so, there's your reason to draw closer to God, because he will always be with you, even in the darkest hours of your life. The second promise that God made is that you will be able to bear with the difficulties of life. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. There is no temptation that has overtaken you that is not common to man. And can I just say it right now? Temptations are not just money and sex and stuff like that. Hardships of life, those are temptations too. Again, Job's wife. Here's the hardships. How does she respond? Curse God and die. Yeah, hardships can be a temptation. They can be a trial and a test for you. But no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. He says we all deal with these struggles sometimes. But God is faithful. And here's God's stepping in, right? He will not let you be tempted above your ability. God will not allow you to be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. Yes, you can endure assaults on your faith, even when those assaults come in the form of hardships and difficulties. Now, it's important to note here, and I think this is an important above what you're able to bear. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 1, because this is the passage sometimes that we look at. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 8. Paul says, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction that we experienced in Asia. This is on the third missionary journey. He said back when we were in Asia, think Ephesus and all the problems Paul had there, Ephesians chapter 19, just think about that. He says, when we were there, we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired even of life itself. You ever been there? Have you ever been burdened beyond your strength to the point that you despaired even of life itself? He says, we were there. And notice it is beyond our strength. It's beyond anything. There's nothing we could do about it. We felt in verse 9 that we had received the sentence of death. But that was in order to, and here's the purpose, that was in order to make us realize that we're not to rely upon ourselves, but upon God, who can even raise the dead. Now you tie that in with 1 Corinthians chapter 10, I think you get the picture, right? God's not going to allow you to be tempted above what you are able to bear, but you will not be able to bear it by your own strength, and that's the key. You will not be able to bear it because you're such a superhuman Christian, and you can do all these, endure all this stuff. No. We endure it. We're able to bear it because we put our faith and our confidence in God. And I think that's the message of 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 8. So we don't bear it because we're so strong. We bear it because God has given us the ability. We are able to bear it by the grace of God, by His help. We can endure these things. And so, do bad things happen to good people? Yep. But you are able to bear it by the grace of God. Him. This is the time to draw closer to Him because He says, I will give you the strength to bear up under whatever the difficulty is. You got to believe that. And how about the third promise? This from Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 32. Remember, the book of Hebrews is written to Jewish Christians. And if you know anything about the early church, there in those early chapters of Acts, going, we'll say from chapter 1 all the way through chapter 7, where you have Stephen, the first martyr for Christ, and then into the early verses of chapter 8, where there was this general persecution that was leveled against all the Christians in Judea, and so most of them scattered. The apostles did not, but most of them did. They scattered. And here, I believe that is what's under reference. You joyfully accepted the plundering of your own property. Could you joyfully accept the plundering of your stuff? They did. Because you knew that you yourselves had a better possession, an abiding possession. And therefore, he says, please do not throw away your confidence. Do not go back to the old Mosaic system. Your confidence, this Christianity thing, he said it has a great reward. You have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you might receive what is promised. For, and here's the quotation, yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by his faith. That from the book of Habakkuk. Just before the Chaldeans came, and the Jews, even the righteous Jews, were about to undergo a tremendous hardship. And he says, you stay strong. The judgment's coming, but you stay strong. The hardships are coming, you stay strong. My righteous one shall live by faith. We can live by faith, brethren, even in the hardships of life, the most severe that you can even imagine. We can stay faithful to God because he will be coming in just a little while. Hardships are temporary, yes. Though not all stories end like Job's did or Joseph's did or these others, some will end more like Stephen. Some will end more like Lazarus, who died a beggar, full of swords. Some will end like that. Some will end like Aquila and Priscilla. You remember how they died? Of course you don't. The Bible doesn't tell us how they died, does it? But I can tell you this. There's a high probability they experience a lot of pain and suffering. If for no other reason, because one of them died and the other one didn't. Could they have died at the same moment of time? Yeah, I guess so. They could have died that way. I don't know. Both got killed in a chariot accident. I don't know. But in all likelihood, one of them died and the other one didn't for a while. For those of you who have lost a spouse, you know what that feels like. You know the hurt and the sorrow that one of them would have experienced when the other one was gone. Yeah, hardships come into all of us, brethren. Sooner or later, to some degree or another, one way or another, hardship comes. Our job is to live by faith, to put our trust in God, keep our eye on eternity, because one day we will be the person in the casket. One day we will be judged for how we have conducted ourselves in this life. Faithful to God, walked with God, stayed close to God, even in the hardships, or not. But we will be judged one way or the other. And if you have been found faithful, God has promised you an eternal inheritance in that paradise where God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there'll be no more pain, no more suffering, no more death. Yeah, I think those are all good reasons to draw closer to God, even when bad things happen. Because good can come from those bad things. We learn lessons from those bad things. But more than all of that, God has made these promises. And if you believe God at all, and that's what faith is, we trust Him, we believe Him. Don't just believe in Him, we believe what He says. Then we have good reason to draw close to God, even in the most difficult of times. And do I need to remind you, the ultimate example of something bad happening to a good man, do I need to remind you? Jesus, not just a good man, the perfect man, the sinless Son of God. Bad things happen all his life. He was a man well acquainted with grief, Isaiah tells us. And we know how his earthly life ended, don't we? We know about that. We know about the kangaroo court. We know about the sham trial. We know about the scourging. We know about the crucifixion, the torture that he experienced for all those hours. And yet he always stayed faithful to his mission, stayed faithful to his Father. And you see how his story ended, didn't you? Because his story actually has no end. He's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We talked about how the stories of some of these guys ended. You know, Abel, oh, that doesn't look very good. And yet he's a hero of faith. Because his story didn't end in Genesis chapter 4. That was only the beginning of Abel's story. And the same is true with all those others we could have looked at. It looked like, oh, bad things happen, right? Lazarus dying, full of sores, a beggar. But the rest of the story was very different, wasn't it? Let's maintain an eternal perspective. Let's keep our faith and trust in God where it belongs. Because, yeah, bad things do happen to good people, but if we are faithful people, they will not destroy us. They will draw us closer to God. That's my prayer for you. If you're not a Christian, you need to become one. Put your faith in Jesus as the Son of God. Repent of your sins. Be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, as Peter put it in Acts 2 and verse 38. If you're a Christian that just needs the prayers of your family here, we encourage you to come while we stand.